Welcome back again. So it'd be nice to be able to create a quote. So that's a pretty important part of CRUD. So let's just go ahead and start doing it, right? So what we're going to do, I'll just kind of point to it here. We're going to create a new method. I called it insert quote. To be honest, I probably should have called it create quote, but I called it insert quote in the notes. You're going to create a query for it, and then you're going to execute it, right? So pretty basic stuff there. And then you're also going to need to call it from someplace. And what we're going to do is we're going to test this one with the deployed version first, and there's a reason for that, and we'll talk about that when we get there. So the first thing I want you to do is I want you to switch over to localhost testing false. So we're just going to talk to deployed to start the ball rolling. And then what I want to do is I want to start off just by going to my query for quotes, and I'm just going to copy paste it just because it's got some useful things in there. So I'm just going to copy this and then just paste it right below and start making updates. So the first update is instead of query for quotes, it's just going to be called insert quote, singular. Instead of taking in a page token, what it's going to take in is it's going to take in the quote to insert, which I'll just call new quote, and that is a GTL MovieQuote. And then it's going to create a query. The type of query that this one created was a list. If I wanted to see what my options were, I can get rid of the word list. I can see my options are delete or insert or list, right? So I want insert, obviously. It wants me to pass it in an object, so I'm going to say new quote. I know it's kind of hard to read with my screen, but as soon as I finish, I'll get it all cleaned up. So let's do that, and let's give you a little bit more screen real estate here. All right, so there is the query. So we got ourselves a new query for an insert. We passed in that object. These other things don't make sense on this particular type of query. I do want to have my little activity indicator show up. I do want to execute the query. So I'm executing a query. I get back a ticket, a response, and an error. That's all the same. I do want to stop the spinner when I'm done. Those two things don't make sense in this context. Error, if the error is nil, then I want to, or not nil, I want to show my error dialog. And then what I'm going to do is if I have an error, I'm just going to return, right? And then to be honest, everything else is new. So this is kind of my basic formula, right? So I create a query, I execute it. If there's an error, I show it and return. And then if there's not an error, I've actually got something good. So the question is, what do I need to do now that my query is back? It turns out that when you make a query, it's got a quote and a title, and you ship it off to the cloud, and then it inserts it in the database, and then it also sends you something back. The thing you got back, the only difference is that it now has a last touch date time and an entity key. Don't care about the last touch date time, but I do care about that entity key. So that entity key is important. Because if anybody wants to delete it or edit it, it has to be associated with that object. And our array doesn't have that association yet. Does that make sense? So we inserted it with just the two things we had into our array, and then we sent it off to the back end, then it came back, and now we just want to add the entity key onto that new quote. The nice thing is we can make a closure here, right? So we've got an access to the new quote. So our to-do here is add to the new quote the entity key from the response. So we got a response. That response is actually the return quote. And so that is response. And that response, we can actually cast it. It's a GTL MovieQuote is what that response is. And the only thing we want to do is the new quote, which is the one in our array. His entity key is equal to the return quote's entity key. And this is important. Not sure why it did not complete for me there. And this is important because if anybody clicks on that row and clicks delete, it sure better have an entity key associated with it. Or if anybody clicks on that row and modifies it, it sure better have an entity key associated with it. So this is really the only thing we have to do. Another thing you could do if you really wanted is you could do a clean query for quotes again. And that would be useful because if anybody else had added something, you would pick it up too. But to be honest, that's not my concern here. I just want to do what's necessary to insert. So I should be able to run this thing with the deployed backend, and I should be able to see a quote get added. So here's my deployed backend. It's easy to see the change in my data. And so I'm just going to say test quote from iOS client, and I'll just write delete me later because I don't want that on my pretty back end. So if I hit create quote, I can see that it slides in right there. And then more importantly, if I go to actually my website and I hit refresh over here, you can see that it'll pop in. Oops, that did not work at all. And I know why. Actually, if you do a pull down to refresh, it'll go away, right? The reason why is I created a function that I never called. Hopefully you were watching that and you're like, this guy's about to do something really dumb. So I've got this to do in here. To do, actually send the quote to the back end. I made that earlier for a reason, I'm sure. And so I'm just going to take that off and I'm going to call my method. I'm inside a closure, so I need to say self.insert quote, and the quote that I want to insert is the one that I just created and added to the array. So I created a movie quote before, I did this already, such that it could get added to the array, and now I want to actually take that one that was purely local and send it to the back end. All right, let's try this again. So let me try a second attempt. So a second attempt at adding a quote from the iOS client. Click on refresh, click on submit, go over here and click on refresh, and there it is, right? So second attempt at adding a quote from the iOS client. Whew, that worked. Let's try the same thing, but with localhost. So I intentionally did the deployed version first. So if I just switch this to localhost testing true, and I run it again, you can see that I've got stuff here, and then I'm just going to say this is going to fail. So sorry. And so I click it, and it shows up here fine, but if I go over to my localhost version and I hit refresh, you'll notice that it is none and none, right? So that's not good. And if I hit pull down over here, you can see it goes away. What the heck? It worked on deployed and it didn't work on localhost. What? How is that even possible, right? And it's not only possible, it's actually expected. And it's a little disappointing. Let's talk about why. So Google likes to do things efficiently, right? That's probably a shock to you. It turns out that a post body is just text, so it's just ASCII text. ASCII text is easy to zip, right? So it's easy to compact. You can reduce it by like 70%, right? So it's a well-known thing. You can make text much more efficient. And so with their post bodies, they have a system where they actually zip it up, and what they send to the back end is just the zip file, and then the back end gets the zip file, unzips it, so it's called a gzip, and then it's the body. Works fine on the deployed version. It's got the mechanism set up to where if it sees a gzip, it just unboxes it for you, no big deal. Localhost doesn't have that capability. I consider that a bug. If you were to complain to Google about it, they would say that's just how the two systems work, right? So we have to like find a hack around it, is basically what we want to do. So come down to your insert method, and what we're going to do is we're going to modify the query depending on if it's localhost testing or not. So if it's localhost testing, we're going to have to do some modifications. And the modification that we're going to have to do is we're going to have to set the JSON directly. So the JSON is the text version, and then the body object is the zip version. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the JSON version of the query directly, and I'm going to blow away the zip version, right? So there's no need for that gzip version at all. It's called the body object. And if I run it again, so this special case will happen only for localhost testing. It should behave much better, right? So localhost using JSON, not a zip. All right, so if I hit create quote on this, you can see it shows up fine there, which it did that before. And then you hit refresh over here, and you can see that localhost says using JSON, not a zip, and that's fine. By the way, if you really wanted to, if you wanted to go check your logs, you can see there's actually an error. It said no variant found for unrecognized field resource. That was the error message you got before. I'm not sure how you're supposed to figure out what that meant, but that meant it had no idea what to do with the zip file on localhost. All right, so that is insert. We've got insert working on both sides. What we would really like to do next is we'd like to be able to delete a quote. So for example, I've got a blank one here. If I hit delete, you know, I can delete it, and it appears to work, except for the fact that that's, you know, just affecting the array only. If I pull down, it just comes right back. All right, come back next time, and we'll work on the D in CRUD. We'll do some delete. All right, see you then. Bye.